Before we get started with the video, although I didn't do it on purpose, it just so happens that this one is coming out on Memorial Day. With Breaker being one of the G.I. Joes that during the Battle of Benzine in the comic series was gunned down by the Saw Viper, that makes it kind of fitting for today. So I wanted to take a second to wish you all a happy Memorial Day and hope you enjoy your barbecues and family time, but also want to make sure that everybody takes a second to remember exactly what Memorial Day is really all about. Thanks everyone. Enjoy the video. Hi everyone, I'm Dr.Animaction. Welcome to the 7th entry in my personnel office, where we take a look at G.I. Joe characters in a real-world context. Today we'll be continuing our journey through the characters as they appeared in the 1982 Joe Packin catalog, in this case, the team's original communications specialist, Breaker. I've definitely got some experience in the realm of his expertise, and some thoughts on the figure, so let's go ahead and jump right in. Oh, but before we do, I wanted to mention that once I finish a year of figures in this series, I plan on doing a companion video that looks at the personality and behavior of each character in both the comics and cartoon, before I move on to the next year. Let me know what you think about that idea in the comments. For now though, here's Breaker. Over. On a personal side note, proper radio usage is by far one of my biggest pet peeves about military representation in popular culture. The biggest offender by far in this area is people always saying over and out. Over and out are mutually exclusive. They're two different terms that mean two different things in military radio operations. Over means I'm done speaking for now and it's your turn to talk, and out means that I am done talking and the conversation's over.
Hello, police. This is Marge Simpson. My husband is on a murderous rampage. Over.
Oh, well, thank God that's over. I was worried there for a second.
I don't see what's so hard about that, but Hollywood can never seem to get it right. Let's start where we've been starting with a look at the front of the carded figure. I see a couple things here that jump out at me, but we'll save those for the more in-depth portions of the video. While we're here though, let's take a second to chat about his codename. I'm pretty confident most of you have heard the common and widely used instance of the term breaker in movies with people that talk on CB using the particular slang unique to that community. For those users, the term is used to just initiate a conversation. So for instance, whenever you hear the whole breaker 19,
Breaker, horn dog. Anybody got their ears on?
that's just someone saying, I want to start talking on channel 19. In the military, break is used to interrupt a current radio interaction with the transmission of a higher priority.
Stand by, Hitman. Break. Assassin, this is Steel Rain. Your grid zone designators are correct. Message to observer.
For example, if there are two call signs discussing personnel movements or supply issues and a combat unit needs fire support on the same channel, regardless of what was happening in the other conversation, the unit calling for fire support would broadcast break, and then send their call for fire. So I'm guessing that's what the codename is referencing more than the colloquial usage. But anyway, let's flip this card over and get into the details of the character. The first thing we see here is that his title is Communications Officer. That wouldn't really be his title, since officer isn't a job description in the military, but rather a rank descriptor. It's more likely he'd be a communications specialist or communications operator, or more commonly than either of those, he'd be listed as a radio telephone operator, or RTO. We do have communications officers in the Army, but they're commissioned officers assigned to the signal branch, and they're generally called signal officers, or SIGOs. I spent half my time in the military as an RTO myself, so it's a position I'm very familiar with and confident talking about. Continuing on, we see that RA serial number I've spoken of in the past, indicating that he's Army, and we see his MOS listed as infantry. This is perfectly reasonable, since RTOs and infantry units are regular infantry personnel assigned the additional duty of carrying and operating communication equipment, usually a single radio. Normally they'll have some minor additional training, but most infantry personnel know basic radio operations. I had quite a bit of additional training as I was assigned to the Tactical Operations Center, or TOC, so I was an RTO on the march and worked with Commo and the TOC on a wider variety of gear like SATCOMs, MSRTs, retransmission deployments, and stationary antenna systems. I'm guessing that would make me a lot closer to Breaker than most infantry actually are. Lastly, in this top section though, we see he's an E4, and that's fine too, as you don't get many NCOs carrying radios. Well, you used to not, but there are a lot more instances of smaller individual communications gear out there keeping everyone connected, so I can't really speak to how things are in today's military. Working our way down the card, we see that he's familiar with all NATO and Warsaw comm gear and, quote, most world export devices, end quote, whatever that means. Maybe they're talking about civilian market communication devices, but I'm honestly not sure. As far as familiarity with all of them, I can only assume that's to the extent that all radios operate on the same basic principle. If you can figure one of them out, you can probably figure most of them out, at least with radios from that period, though that's likely not as applicable with modern radios with increased functionality and more digital than mechanical interfaces. It also says he's been to signal school, which is actual MOS training and would make him a 31 series rather than 11 series. Covert Electronics, which we discussed in the Flash video, so you can go check that one out if you haven't already, and Project Gamma, which isn't a school, but rather seems to be a Special Forces covert intelligence group from Vietnam. The timeline of that wouldn't line up for someone who's an E4 in 1982, so I think that's just on his card because it sounded mysterious. We can also see he's a qualified expert with an M16 and an M1911, which are normal qualifications, but MAC-10 is also listed there as well, which was used by Special Forces in Vietnam all the way up through the invasion of Grenada in 1983, so that would be fine here as well. The only issue I have is all the indications that he served in some Special Forces capacity, but the card not having any mention of it in his training section. The fact that he also apparently speaks 7 languages would hint at more of a special operations or communications background than basic infantry as well. Finally, looking at the card though, we see the flavor text, and being both efficient and confident are fairly important traits for an RTO. I'm not sure about turning situations to his advantage though, as usually the RTO calls someone else to turn that situation around, or to get the unit the hell out of the adverse situation altogether. So there wasn't anything really on the card itself that stuck out as inappropriate or unrealistic, but the timeline for some of the things listed there doesn't really line up, and there were some areas that conflicted a bit. I would have liked to have seen mention of Ranger or Special Forces School on there at least. Interestingly enough, Breaker's the only character in this initial year of releases that doesn't have a secondary military specialty listed, but one of the characters that would have probably benefited most from one. Anyway, let's move from the card to the figure and see what we can see there. As I've been doing throughout this series, we'll take a look here at both the included equipment and the figure's molded features. We'll start with the figure itself and take a look at something I haven't really mentioned up until this point. Specifically, let's talk about the fact that he has a beard. There are honestly some Special Forces operators out there with beards when missions require them, some soldiers authorized to wear beards for religious considerations, and guys with beards for medical reasons. You wouldn't see someone that wore one full-time in an operational unit like the Joes, though. There are a couple reasons for this that are actually pretty logical. The first is a matter of military uniformity and standards of appearance, but those that are there for hair and facial hair are not just to keep everyone looking similar, but also because it's easier to keep short hair clean and infestation-free during extended field time. Not having facial hair also makes it easier to apply and remove camouflage paint from your face. Lastly, and probably most importantly, short hair and a clean face make it easier to see and treat head wounds in combat. The other most significant reason that soldiers don't have facial hair from a combat perspective is that being clean-shaven means that your protective mask can get an airtight seal in case of a chemical or biological attack. The last thing you want if you're forced to mask up is one that leaks, and having facial hair between your face and the seal means potential vulnerabilities.
The goggles do nothing.
Continuing our look, we see that he's wearing standard load-bearing suspenders like most of the characters in this series, which makes sense as the same chest mold was used for him, Stalker, Grunt, and Snake Eyes. Like them, he's got a pair of pouches on his shoulders, most likely holding a compass and field dressing, plus a knife and a grenade. Nothing too unusual here other than the grenade type not being period appropriate, which I've talked about in previous episodes, and it not being very conveniently located for comfortable low crawling. Other than that, we see he's got a couple of molded details on his legs, but it's hard to tell what they might be. On the card art, they're the same olive drab as his uniform, but on the figure they're painted with silver to highlight them and make me think they're supposed to be more technical or mechanical. Considering the time period, I would expect one of those to be a pocket containing his code book and cheat sheets for frequencies and call signs and the like, but that other one could be anything. Knowing the extent of Breaker's expertise, I think it would be reasonable to assume it's some form of toolkit. Lastly, for the molded figure though, he seems to be wearing tanker boots, which as I've said before, you wouldn't normally see on an infantryman. Shifting focus to his accessories finds a helmet, a headset, and a backpack. The helmet's normal and fine, but the headset isn't really a good fit. An infantryman's senses are important when you're out on the march, ensuring that you can see, smell, and hear potential threats, so you'd never see anyone wearing a headset that fully covered their ears. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, there is no such headset in the Army inventory. That's especially true for this era, when most RTOs just took the radio handset onto the shoulder of their LBE so they can hear it in a moderate volume. That's what I used to do, as it makes it the most easily accessible, or in some circumstances, I'd even clip it directly to my helmet chin strap so it rested against one ear. The other reason you wouldn't have a headset like that is because usually the RTO is attached to someone in a leadership position and has to be able to hand off the mic to them so they can communicate directly with other units. Finally here we see his backpack, which is notionally his radio. At this point in history, the Army used something designated as the ANPRC-77, which stood for Army-Navy Portable Radio Communication. This was a 24-pound battery-operated analog radio, which was about the same size as Breaker's backpack appears to be, but otherwise looked nothing like it. I'm honestly not sure what all the details on the accessory are supposed to be, since the Prick 77 only had a pair of dials for adjusting the frequency with a small window to see the frequency dial, a couple of switches to change the mode and settings, and various data ports to connect things like the handset, antenna, encoding devices, additional power sources, and a couple of other things like that. I'll assume on the model that Breaker is carrying that the rectangles on the bottom are dust covers for those ports or something, with the details on the top being for display and settings. The radio model that came after the Prick 77, the ANPRC 177, or SINGARS, didn't look anything like this either, having only a few switches and data ports like the 77, with the main difference being the 177 had a digital display and a full 10-digit keypad. Moving along, there are several aspects of his gear that need to have some changes or additions though. First and foremost of these is that Breaker should have a weapon. As an infantryman carrying the single most important piece of equipment that a unit in the field has, an RTO has to be able to defend both himself and any leadership who will be using the radio and unable to do so for themselves. In fact, I personally atypically carried an M249 SAW when I was an RTO, which is a squad automatic weapon, since the TOC was crewed by a small number of people. You wouldn't normally see that because you don't want to have somebody carrying both a 25-pound weapon and a 25-pound radio, plus batteries and ammo, and etc., etc., but because the TOC was primarily stationary, nobody seemed to mind in my case. Breaker would at least be carrying a standard rifle, probably an M16, and probably a pistol as well. There's also the fact that the radio doesn't have an antenna attached. Radios usually have a flexible 3-foot short whip antenna, as well as a second 10-foot antenna the RTO would carry in case they needed extra power or range. That would mean he'd need some kind of rucksack or something for additional radio equipment. More than almost any of those other missing pieces that he'd be carrying and need the capacity for would be additional batteries. Radios with no power are just plain useless, so you always make sure you've got enough to last the duration of your mission. My standard loadout was the battery in the radio and 2 extras, understanding that mine lasted longer than the batteries being used in the early 80s. They're as important as ammunition for an infantry squad. But that's pretty much it though. Give him a shave, a weapon, some kind of backpack, an antenna, and switch the headset for a handset and you've got a pretty realistic RTO. In fact, the version of him in the Impel card is pretty right on the money. He's one of the closest to real life in this original series so far. And that's my in-depth look at how Breaker compares to his real-world counterpart, which in this case was kind of me. Like I said in my opening, this is a role that I filled for several years, and although I carried a little newer equipment, the duties, knowledge, and role itself hadn't really changed that much. I'd say that the Breaker character was overall fairly true to life, with the exception of those few minor changes I suggested. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, let me know about that and my future plans for this series in the comments below. And check back soon as we do this again for the Joe's Original Mortar Man short fuse. Also check back in a couple of days for the 1982, I think, episode in the animated 80s Japan edition. And before we move on to the animated 70s, I'll be going back to do the animated 90s in film, which I was reminded that we haven't covered yet. Anyway, thanks for watching. Stay tuned and stay tuned, as in cartoons. Later.